So working as a vaquero was very hard, long hours on horses, working with cattle. But during the downtimes for vaqueros, what they did was they relaxed by riding and roping some more. Uh, they would gather in open fields and they would compete against each other by racing horses and performing rope tricks. Um, and they did this, and it was just kind of a point of pride just to see who was the most skilled with the lasso, who had the fastest horse, who had the most skill with the horse. This is also one of the things, I didn't talk about this in the previous podcast. They would also leap from horses to take down a wrestle down a steer. Of course, we see this to this very day. And they would race the clock for the shortest time to rope a calf and the longest time to stay on a bucking horse. Again, all facets of the rodeo that we see today. Now, over time, the folks in the area would gather to look at these events. It would become a celebration, it would become a party, and this is the birth of the rodeo. And of course, now, as we all know, rodeos are very big businesses in Texas to this very day. But the key thing in kind of one of the aspects of Texas history I want to get in your mind here is that the next time you go to the rodeo, if I'm not going to tell you what to think, but you might pause a second and think about that the rodeo is a legacy of Spanish Texas. It has a very, very deep history that goes way past the Anglo period. That what you're walking into when you walk into the rodeo is one of the permanent legacies of the Spanish period of Texas. Now, beginning in the 1770s, the Spanish government starts to regulate the cattle industry. Up until the 1750s, no cattle were branded whatsoever. There's a lot of confusion, who owned what cows. We don't have fencing at this point. But most importantly, from the point of view of the Spanish government by the 1770s, 1780s, has decided that it wants to have ranchers brand their cattle because the Spanish government wants to start taxing cattle. Because finally, Spanish Texas, has created a business that's generating an income, and this is very consistent of governments. They always want to tax any business that's generating an income, that they want to grab a piece of that to help governmental operations. So in the mid 1790s, 1795, what happened is all ranchers in Texas were given 1 year to round up and brand their wild livestock. They didn't have to pay taxes that year. And by the way, I'm not going to test you on the year 1795. What I want is this big picture of the Spanish government regulating cattle by the late 1790s or the mid 1790s. They're not taxing any cattle that year, and they give the ranchers in Texas a year to brand all their cattle. So by the end of 1795, all cattle were supposed to be branded. And what we're seeing here again is the Spanish government imposing regulation on the cattle business in Texas in order to collect taxes, but also because something very interesting has started to happen, and that's the transportation of cattle to distant markets. Now, this is the transportation of Texas cattle to distant markets. Now, this is something else that defines Texas historically, the cattle drives. And the cattle drives are usually seen as an event that occurred after the U.S. Civil War, from the 1860s to about the 1880s, when the railroad came in and kind of took over that business. Once again, I want to point out that cattle drives, uh, although they're often seen as an Anglo event, cattle drives started in Spanish Texas. They're a legacy of Spanish Texas. And what you had by the end of the Spanish period was an infrastructure that had been built up during the Spanish period about how to drive cattle to distant markets. Now, where were these markets that cattle were being driven to in during the Spanish period? Well, a small number of cattle were being driven south to places like Saltillo, into Coahuila. So you start having a small number of cattle being driven south, but more importantly, you have Texas cattle being driven into Louisiana. Now, this is very, very interesting because the Spanish government had very, very ambivalent feelings about whether or not Texas cattle should be allowed to go into Louisiana. One of the things that the government was really worried about was smuggling, that Texas cattle would go into Louisiana, it wouldn't be taxed, it would be sold in Louisiana, and which the Spanish government didn't really care about. But what they cared about is that Texas cattle are going into Louisiana without being taxed. So the Spanish government isn't getting its cut of what's becoming an increasing trade. So by the 1780s, 1790s, you start, it begins with a trickle, and then you start having a couple of thousand Texas cattle from San Antonio, but especially from La Bahia, the Goliad area, going into Louisiana. Now, I want to talk for a second real quick about numbers. Probably at its height, the missions owned something like maybe 10,000 cattle annually. That would be the size of the herds. The size of the herds around La Bahia, around Goliad, actually were much larger, probably 3 to 4 times the size of the San Antonio missions. La Bahia, the grass there, there's just a lot more grassland. The cattle did quite well there. So maybe La Bahia, Goliad, there might have been as many as 40,000 cattle. So the key thing is that by the late 1700s, you have a small market of Texas cattle going into across the Rio Grande into states like Coahuila, but you have a much larger market of Texas cattle going into Louisiana. And the reason for this is there was a great demand for Texas cattle in Louisiana because the population of Louisiana is growing very, very rapidly. New Orleans has become a very successful city. So there's a much bigger market for Texas cattle in Louisiana than there is in Coahuila. And, goods always go to markets where there's market demand. So what happened is that the Spanish government allows trade into Louisiana, ultimately decides it can't stop it. And folks, cattle ranchers were supposed to pay taxes and that kind of thing, but in reality, they seldom did. And from the Spanish government's point of view, and once again, Louisiana is a big problem. Even though Louisiana is controlled by the Spanish, remember the Spanish took control of Louisiana in the 1760s, the Spanish government had all these internal taxes. So you didn't have free trade between Spanish Texas and Spanish Louisiana. Actually, this was one of the real problems with the Spanish rule. They had so many internal taxes, it really, really retarded a lot of trade. So anyway, what you had is Texas cattle more and more, even before 1800, are being smuggled into Louisiana. And the reason that this is not very hard to do is the Spanish just don't have many soldiers in Texas. They can't really police Texas very well. So what you have by the end of the 1700s is very, very active smuggling of cattle and to a lesser extent horses from Spanish Texas into Louisiana. It's Spanish Louisiana. And because there's such a demand in Louisiana. And this is the business, ranching of cattle and horses, that becomes the most significant aspect of the economy of Spanish Texas. And as I said before, it leaves its legacy to this very day.